67 years ago, a city as vigorous as ours, a city full of children going to school and mothers going to work and fathers shopping and market, was incinerated in an instant. 67 years ago. 50 years ago, this city, the city of Portland, thinking about that city, started protesting the brandishing of atomic weapons, started protesting atomic power, nuclear power for peaceful uses, and the proliferation and the theft of all our budgets that those weapons were going to cost in the decades and the decades and the decades to come. So 50 years ago, right here in Portland, Oregon, among others, Auntie Carol Erner, Auntie Carol and Portland Women for Peace, American Friends Service Committee, Fellowship for Reconciliation, made a march around a perimeter that would be about the size of Hiroshima, lost in that instant, exhaled in that moment. 50 years. So when the Reverend talks about change, and when our Indian brothers talk about making the best of our sorrows, this is the best of our sorrows. These big-hearted, broad-shouldered Americans. This could be a somber moment, a commemoration, but I think it's so much more than that, as you will see with the young folks you'll see tonight.
We have come and gathered in both remembrance, sorrow, and hope in this sacred place of beauty, to both remember a shadow that we, your creatures, cast upon the world, but also to come out of those shadows into your light and proclaim that we affirm life, that we will do all in our power to stop the shadow making of our times, and that we will remember all those who not only lost their lives at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also all those who continue to be made victims of shadows of violence today. May we use our discoveries of your world to heal rather than to harm life. August 6th has meaning, because we will not forget, and we will not be frozen in destruction of the past. August 6th has meaning because it is a fixed point in time that reminds us that we make the history of our own day and that our decisions and actions touch human life in profound and lasting ways. Holy One, August 6th has meaning because it is today, and it represents an opportunity to choose another path, a different direction, and the gift of life as the touchstone for all that we do with the living of our days.
Hi, my name is Saori. I'd really like to thank PSR for inviting me here today. I'm, as a half Japanese child who's grown up in America, this event has made such a huge impact on who I am and the way I look at the world, and I'm just so honored that I was invited here today, so thank you so much, and please enjoy.
If you go down river here, a little less than 15 miles, you run into this splendid river Columbia, a grand matriarch that drains about a quarter of our continent. These two rivers join, and about 70 urgent salmon miles later, it's out in that big, deep Pacific Ocean. You go another 50 miles, and all those waves come back and rain. They come back and rain. At least not today. But mind you, a month from now, you'll be seeing that rain coming off these rooftops, down these rivulets, return to this river, and that great grand cycle that great grand cycle that makes this such an auspicious place to live, and I think makes Portland a kind of people carrying this legacy and carrying this promise. Kathleen Flenniken is the poet laureate for the state of Washington, and she has a story to tell. Because up that river where she turns north into the state of Washington and heads towards Canada is the Hanford nuclear facility, the plant that first made the fissionable plutonium that ended up as atomic bombs dropped on living cities full of those school children, those working moms, and those shopping dads I was telling you about earlier. She has a story to tell about that cycle. She recently published a book called Plume, and in that book reclaims the heritage of her hometown. As she says, seeing the town she grew up with in adult eyes and trying to reconcile herself and those really good, hardworking people there to who we are, what we've done, and what we can be. So please let me introduce to you then with a big round of applause, 2012-2014 Washington State Poet Laureate, Kathleen Flenniken.
Learning of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a rite of passage in our post-atomic world. And I certainly remember the first time that I learned about the atomic bomb because I felt implicated by it. And it happened right here in Portland. I was about 7 years old, and we had driven down to Portland to visit my cousins, and they had a brand new color TV. So this was about 1967. And we didn't have a color TV at home, just black and white. So, of course, I was mesmerized by anything on the TV. And everybody around me was jumping around and chatting, and we just arrived. And I saw this huge, enormous, violent orange explosion on the color television. And I was watching it, and then someone said something about an atomic bomb. And then a man was speaking on the television, who I didn't recognize, but turned out to be Harry Truman. And then they returned back to another explosion again, and that expression again, atomic bomb. Now, I certainly knew the word atomic because I grew up in what we called the Atomic City. We called it the atom-bustin' village of the West. And we had atoms on our city seal. There was a picture of an atom on the top of the theater marquee. There was atomic bowling lanes, an atomic body shop. So for me, the word atomic meant space age and modern. It meant American, and it meant all kinds of positive things. And I had never heard it linked to a bomb before. So I have never forgotten that cognitive dissonance to this day. I realized somehow, I knew on some level that I was implicated in some manner by this explosion I saw on the television. When I did learn the story of Hanford a little bit later, it was always told with pride. It was a story about how they built a nuclear reactor in 13 months in complete secrecy. 50,000 workers came and created this out of nothing, and they ended the war, and it was always told with pride. And I thought of it as a kind of creation story because, like the biblical creation story, it talked about loss of innocence and a kind of miracle, and it explained who we were and why we were here. And so it just kind of told me a little bit about how to think about who I was. But I have had to revisit who I am and why I am here. And that process began when my friend Carolyn's father died in about 1988 of a radiation illness. He was one of these guys who was a die-hard Hanford supporter. He was a labor union president. He'd done loads of dirty work, we find out now. He died of a very rare blood disease that really had only been seen previously in survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was very clearly a radiation illness. About 2001, my parents passed away, and between those two dates, I had started to write poems. I didn't start out writing poems. I started doing that later. And I started to give myself permission then to think back about growing up at Hanford and what that had meant. And I had even worked at Hanford for 3 years as an engineer. I'd worked in waste management. So this was all very personal, and I did it step by step. It was done in baby steps. All the while I was trying to work towards some kind of, as I started writing these poems, they started out being very personal, and I was trying to work towards some kind of more comfortable understanding of where I had come from. And I have to tell you that I have not gotten to any more comfortable understanding. But I wanted to share a few of the poems that I've written along the way that have been part of that journey. And I'm going to begin with the very first poem that I wrote about Hanford. This is called The Bedroom Community. And it's a poem I wrote as a kind of letter to my friend Carolyn, as just a kind of mark of maybe an apology that I somehow didn't understand at the time what her father was giving and the people he represented. Bedroom Community. We were all bedded down in our nightcaps, curtains drawn as swamp coolers and sprinklers hissed every brown summer hour, or in winter, sagebrush hardened in the cold. It was still dark as our fathers rose, dressed, and boarded blue buses that pulled away, and men in milk trucks came collecting bottled urine from our doorsteps. Beyond the shelter belt of Russian olive trees, cargo trains shuffled past at 8 and 8, and the wide Columbia rolled by, silent with walleye and steelhead. We pulled up our covers while our overburdened fathers dragged home to fix a drink, and some of them grew sick. Carolyn, your father's marrow testified. Whistles from the train, the buses came, our fathers left. Oh, Carolyn, while the rest of us slept. After I wrote the first series of poems out of my memory of growing up in Richland, I started to read in earnest about the history of Hanford, and I used Michelle Gerber's Environmental History on the Home Front as my primary guide. This did more to wrench me out of my defensive, protective posture, which I confess to, than any confrontational kind of finger-pointing treatise ever could. I met the facts in declassified Hanford documents in the words of the Hanford decision-makers themselves. I learned more about the environmental contamination at the site than I ever discovered when I worked at Hanford as an engineer in the hydrogeology unit straight out of college, which I think is kind of remarkable. I encountered for the first time an account of the Green Run, an intentional release of radioiodine and xenon for the purpose, we think, of monitoring Soviet weapon production. It involved a processing run of uranium fuel that had been cooled for only a short time and was therefore green. The weather turned that night of December 2nd, 1949, and the resulting cloud contaminated a wide swath of south and east. What struck me when I first heard of the Green Run was how beautiful the name sounded to my ears, especially contrasted with the reality of the event. And so I decided to use that tension to write an account of it. And this is a poem called The Green Run, which commemorates that night, December 2nd, 1949. Green, a verdant dream, grass avenues framed by trees. Green, untested, young. Run, as in long limbs racing. Green, as in raw, uncured, uranium slugs aged 16 days instead of 90. Run, meaning batch, an 8,000 curie brew. Or green, lush with buds, or with radioiodine 131, dead night, stack a-belching when the weather turns to snow. Run, as in production fallout over thousands of square miles. Green, as in sickly, taken up by the thyroid. Run, as in hide, as in keep the lid on this disaster. Run, as in spill, as out of cauldron. Green, meaning easily deceived, meaning run. I moved away from Richland in my 20s. My efforts to understand the Hanford community were made easier with distance. But what of all the workers who remained? There are deeply seated cultural taboos in place that have included for decades speaking about illnesses that might relate to Hanford work. And yet hundreds of people attended and overflowed the Federal Building Auditorium in February 2000, when the Department of Energy invited the community to speak openly for the very first time about their health problems. I wasn't there, but my friend Carolyn was, and she described the evening to me, and that became the basis for my poem called Deposition. I wasn't there. I'd packed my car with houseplants years ago, confident my rawhide neighbors would change their camper's oil, mow and edge their lawns like always. Street after street of Hanford workers who'd moved 30 years ago from West Virginia or Pennsylvania or Tennessee for a job, no saying what it was, for a prefab landscaped with white rocks, for their kids grown up like me, for their wives, hair freshly done, comparing prices at Safeway. You know one, you know them all, I said at 25, and moved away, brushed off the dust, and breathed in the liberal city. So I wasn't there when one by one they rose, walked stiffly up the aisle in the Federal Building Auditorium. And yet I see them clearly, the same bastards who grinned when schoolgirls strolled by, who flirted with John Birch and hunted pheasant, and owned the stools at the cinderblock taverns downtown, whose sons and daughters would appear at school, sometimes with bruises on their arms. Carolyn was there to testify, and even she can't explain how anybody there met anybody else's eyes. It must have choked their throats like rotting meat, admitting to cancers and hothouse flower blood diseases, each a different suffering. How did they stand on stage and say what nobody could say aloud? And the ones who came but couldn't speak. It's killing to think of, even now. Every one of them ashamed for falling ill the way the anti-nuke fanatics said we would. Who've never known shit about anything. Who've never understood us and never will. Growing up, I knew just one version of the story of the atomic bomb, and it was triumphant. Now I am convinced that nuclear weapons have proven too costly even to fathom. The people who created and fueled our atomic arsenal were not evil. They were my neighbors, my community. They were patriotic, skillful, intelligent men and women. And yet, we contaminated the environment, withheld and twisted information, and betrayed ourselves anyway. I stood in the Smithsonian American History Museum in 2010 and stared at a Richland Bombers t-shirt from my high school behind glass. And a few feet away, I studied black and white photos of victims of the Nagasaki blast. I will close with a poem that speaks to my education about those bombs dropped 67 years ago today, which has been slow and is not over. This is called Museum of Doubt, Nagasaki Photos. My love, allow yourself to stall just a little, then enter the collection of black and white victims. Like ink blots, they await your reply. Focus. I'm holding your hand. Their shadows on bridges and walls stop at 11:02 like interrupted sundials. That, at least, you can respond to. You'll never make sense of rubble. The raw body proves difficult braille. Illness you can fathom. with its slippers scuffing along a glassy hall. But can you feel it? A kimono pattern imparted to the wearer's skin. Beloved, you've been carefully trained. Do you sense your resistance? Meaning is lost between the vulnerable eye and well-defended mind. Who's on your side? You keep asking. Not righteousness, not at this late hour. Look at you unsure, but sure underneath. Thank you very much.